All right, ladies and gentlemen, take your seats and let's start. It's my great honor and pleasure and privilege to welcome all of you here, but especially to welcome our guest, Bruno Maçãesem, if I pronounce it correctly, or at least somehow correctly, who has come to Prague, has been here already for some time, and whose book is published these days. It's the first of the books to be published. This is Geopolitics for the End Time, from the pandemic to the climate crisis. But before Christmas, you can buy some Christmas presents also, that another book will be published this year, History Has Begun. Bruno is a prolific writer and commentator and speaker at various conferences and working with different think tanks. So he's very much also active on Twitter, but he did have political career or state service career. He was Minister for European Affairs of Portugal. And I must say that his thoughts and ideas and books and writings are always inspiring. We did have him here once at the Transatlantic Center on an online discussion during the COVID times. And it's great that maybe COVID is not over yet fully, but definitely it's great that people are starting to come and people are starting to gather, and that we can be here and that he has made it to the Czech Republic for the visit. So I do welcome him here. We have about 90 minutes. He will have a brief, short introduction. Then Honza Ružička will ask some questions. I will also ask some questions. And then it's going to be open for you to ask questions or have sharp comments that Bruno will be ready, of course, to answer and recommend on your comments. So thank you very much for coming. Of course, thanks to the PPF Foundation, not only for supporting the Transatlantic Center with the other companies, but also supporting specifically this group and publication of your books. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, very kind introduction. And thank you for coming. It's great to see so many people here. Now, just a very short introduction to the book. It is a book written to some extent about the pandemic, but it's not a book only about the pandemic. It's a book about the present moment and also a book about geopolitics. It's a book where I try to explain the meaning of geopolitics. What is geopolitics and what is geopolitics becoming in our time? But it was a book written in the middle of the pandemic, and many people asked me at the time, including my agent and my publishers, why can't you wait a little bit until the end and then write about what happened? But I thought it was important to write about the pandemic in the middle of the pandemic. I think it would be slightly dishonest intellectually to wait until the end when you know how the story ended before making your guesses, your educated guesses, and trying to understand. Also have the impression, looking back to books, let us say, about the French Revolution, that the books that I find most interesting were actually written in the middle of the French Revolution. And when a historian writes about the French Revolution 100 or 200 years later, something is lost. Don't think that this is necessarily going to be a better book because you're writing to a considerable extent from other books that you've read. You've not been there, you have not watched it, you are using other books as your source. But people who are writing in the middle of the event, they have a direct access to the event. Obviously, I haven't reread the book recently. I'll reread the Czech edition. I haven't reread the book recently. I suspect some things when you read it might sound slightly out of date, or perhaps some predictions that I make didn't exactly come true. I'm willing to accept that. I think the general framework is still valid, but the idea was precisely that in the middle of the event, with all the freshness of the events around you, you would try to make sense what is happening. And the pandemic was, I think maybe we're starting to forget it, and that was part of the reason I wanted to record those impressions early on. But it was a dramatic event in our lives. Things happened that we all thought would be impossible. Those lockdowns, radical change to our way of life, things that no one thought would ever see. Those dramatic images of empty streets. I remember a headline in the Times of London, and this is the literal headline because I'll never forget. Christmas cancelled by mutant virus. Christmas cancelled by mutant virus. You know, feels like the headline in a horror disaster movie, but not in real life. The book tries to make sense of these events. It's to some extent a personal book with some personal impressions, but then it starts from those impressions and tries to give you a philosophy of the pandemic. What will the pandemic mean? Not in terms of the policy decisions you make, not in terms of the news of the day, not in terms whether a vaccine has been invented or not invented, whether the vaccine works. It's not that kind of book, and it doesn't describe the events as they happen. I didn't want to write that kind of book because I remember the events very well, and as a reader, I wouldn't enjoy reading a repetition. It is a book that gives you a kind of philosophy of the pandemic. What does the pandemic mean? And my suggestion, very briefly, you'll see in the book later, my suggestion very briefly is that pandemic forced us to rethink our relation with nature, our concept of nature. We moved towards a sense of nature as a force that can never be completely controlled. And that is not the dominant idea over the past century or two. We believe that nature could be finally controlled. So we are sent back towards a concept of nature as a force that we are constantly battling, but never reaching a final decision, constantly protecting ourselves against the threats that come from nature, but never having a final victory over it. And that's a certain theory of modern society and modern technology. The book, you'll see, is to a considerable extent a book about technology, about how we think about technology and what technology can become. And I make the suggestion in the book that the pandemic will be remembered in the future as the beginning of a technological revolution that will ultimately take us beyond human biology. In a sense, it's the final battle between human beings and natural biology, where we try to find a protected home where we can not find a final victory over nature, but some kind of protection and some kind of safety. What is that battle against technology? It goes in two directions. On the one hand, towards a digital world, towards a world of digital technology. We saw that with Zoom, with online education, with tele-entertainment, but I think we'll see a lot more of that. The concept that has come to symbolize this departure from the physical world into the digital world is now the Metaverse. The sense that we can replicate all elements of the physical world using digital technology, but increasing our powers, and of course being protected from things like viruses. And on the other hand, it may also be recorded and remembered as the beginning of a biotechnological revolution. Don't underestimate the importance of mRNA vaccines and what they represent in terms of using genetic technology to reach superior outcomes in the fight against cancer, fight against other diseases. You know that there's vaccines against cancer that are being tested and that use mRNA vaccines and mRNA technology. And not only protection against diseases, but soon enough enhancing our capacities and enhancing human nature. So the suggestion I conclude the book with is we may perhaps remember these 2 years of the pandemic as a great tragedy, but also as the beginning of a technological revolution that over the next decade or two will fundamentally transform how human beings think about themselves and how they relate to the world and to nature. What does that mean for geopolitics? I think that's what we're going to talk about now with Jan, with Thomas.
So thank you very much first, Bruno, for intro. When we discussed with Thomas and with Katerina, godmother of this event, so when we discussed how to play this, so we divide it into two parts and Bruno already mentioned there is some new world being created. So first I will ask a few questions about this new world, and then of course we need to do something about this new world. We need to react somehow practically, and it's going to be on Thomas. So I will kick my first observation and also question, and it's actually came to my mind yesterday. So yesterday we were driving jointly from Berlin, Bruno from conference, I got some meetings there in the parliament, and we were driving not to Prague, we were driving to Litoměřice to meet Sasha Vondra, and we got discussion at Sasha's house about environmentalism and climate change and of course Green Deal and etc. And basically the idea came to our minds that, you know, previously, 100 years ago, actually conservationism, not environmentalism, but conservationism was conservative idea. It was not Greta Thunberg, it was not left, it was not revolutionary change of the world. And last 10 years it was all about that, but now, and it's also in the book, it's changing. And since yesterday at Litoměřice and now throughout today, various interviews, you reiterated the vision that now it might be actually come back more as a geopolitical tool, more as an economic tool, maybe even more, maybe as a tool for European Union to thrive again. So basically to use it practically, not as a civil religion. So if you can a little bit elaborate on this.
Yes, thank you, Jan. So what did we learn from the pandemic that we can use for the climate crisis and other coming crises? Many commentators have suggested that the pandemic is similar to the climate crisis in the sense that it shows how dangerous a technological world has become. Now, I challenge this view, and I don't know anyone who has reacted to the pandemic in this way. Has anyone reacted to the pandemic by saying that we have to abolish capitalism, or that we have to get rid of technology, or we have to go back to a simpler way of life? I don't know anyone who has reacted like this. Because after all, we know that when we had a simpler way of life, there were pandemics too, just as devastating. I think there was a obvious commonsensical reaction to the pandemic was we need to develop the technologies to overcome this problem. And there's only two ways out. Either we all get COVID before vaccines, or we try to get COVID after vaccines. We're all going to get COVID. It's a question of whether, I don't know how many people here have survived so far, not me. So the question is, we have to find the technological tools to fight the pandemic. And the better technology, the best. It wasn't enough to have old-fashioned vaccines. We wanted to have the best kind of vaccine technology that we could have. Now, why is it the case that when we turn to the climate crisis, we seem to have the opposite view, that the way to address the climate crisis is to go back to a simpler way of life, to get rid of some capitalist structures, to reduce our technological footprint? So I'm hoping and thinking that as we reflect about the pandemic, we change the way we think about the climate crisis. And we realize that the climate crisis is similar to the pandemic in the sense that it is an environmental crisis. It is a challenge posed to human beings by natural forces that are inhospitable and threatening. And in fact, it's still a natural crisis. The Earth, we have this misguided language about the climate crisis that we have to save the planet. We don't have to save the planet. It's going to do very well. From the point of view of the planet, whether that's 2 degrees hotter or 2 degrees colder is exactly indifferent. The planet has been hundreds of degrees warmer in the past, and it did very well. We don't have to save the planet. to save ourselves from the planet. I know for some of you this is maybe slightly counterintuitive, but it's one of the lessons that I withdrew from the pandemic. This is how we have to think about it, and the solution is technological. The solution to the climate crisis is technological. It could be two kinds of solution. It could be a moderate technological solution, and what that means is replacing the current energy paradigm and the current energy technologies by different energy technologies. Or then a more radical direct solution where we try to change the planet itself, not just our energy paradigm. And there are some radical ideas about spreading aerosols into the atmosphere to reflect sunlight. Now, we have to be cautious about this second approach, but I suspect, give it another decade or two, and we're going to be having very serious discussions about this, because obviously the strategy of reducing emissions as such, with no other goal, just trying to reduce emissions, is not going to work. And every year we see that we're not being successful doing this. That's not enough. That's fundamentally not enough. And so the solution has to be a burst of technological innovation applied in a prudent, cautious way. I'm the first one to suggest that, but it's been for me the lesson of the pandemic, and obviously, and I think you'll agree with me on this, climate politics cannot be the only exception to democratic politics. There has to be different solutions, and we argue about those solutions, which one is best and which one is worse, but we seem to have come to a point where climate politics is offered from above by experts or prophets of some kind, and we're just supposed to accept it. There has to be an open democratic debate about what is the best approach. There may even be a left-wing climate politics and a right-wing climate politics. Or is climate politics the only kind of politics that does not obey the rules of democracy?
Another big topic in this book, and also on a Substack or on a Twitter, and we debated in a few interviews before, it's this, and you just mentioned it, this, strong belief in technological progress coming now. Sort of even like I would label you as a tech evangelist in a way. And it might be so if we think about, and you mentioned mRNA vaccines, in 1 year, yes, there was some research behind, but, it was super speedy. So you believe that, and not only when we are talking about climate change, but other topics, and especially in energy field, do you think that we will be able, with effort and money, to bridge this, as it is called, green gap, that basically the technologies that we need, for this kind of battle are not even here, because now a lot of these technologies, just let's think about Kadarash, 40 years already. So how you think about this possibility, about this tech buzz coming into reality?
Well, I think it's possible. First of all, we have to get rid of this resistance to technology. We have gotten into this habit of think of technology as some kind of enemy, when technology is human ingenuity, human creativity applied systematically, human thought applied to the outside world. This is what technology is about. But there's this sense now that digital technology is an enemy of free speech, an enemy of democracy, and an enemy of human creativity. And the same is applied to other kinds of technology, particularly in Europe, one has to say. So artificial intelligence has now in Europe acquired a bad name. If you see the documents coming from Brussels, unfortunately, there was a AI strategy published recently, and the first 2 pages are about, immediately the first few sentences are about the threats of AI. If there's nothing else to discuss, only the threats. We have here probably one of the greatest breakthroughs in human science and technology, machine learning, and what could come after. And the reaction is, this is only a threat, and this has to be stopped. It's paradoxical that we have gotten into this moment when, at the same time that human creativity is creating these new technologies, human will is trying to stop them. I mean, we're trying to stop the very things that we create. It's a process that should be subject to some kind of psychoanalysis, because after all, technology is not being imposed on us by some kind of devil, or it's not being imposed on us by God. We're the ones who are inventing these things and then attacking them as coming from our evil side. So once we get rid of these odd habits, I believe, then we can make progress. But the moment is not particularly a good one in that sense.
If we now try to be a little bit, say, practical. So you mentioned European Commission documents on AI. When we look on the, let's call it, multiple global box, we see huge activity in the United States in tech, huge activity in Asia, and not only in China, in Singapore, Indonesia, Philippines, India. And then European Union talking about AI as a threat. And in other areas, it's similar, you know, the vaccines in US, the internet 3.0, commercial internet, etc. Platformization. Platforms are mostly in US, and not only China, but again in Southeast Asia. So what is your practical view now when we look on your book that is about technological buzz and evangelization? So what would be your maybe advice to our friends in Brussels?
Well, we have to get rid of those habits. You know, we have to understand that, again, we're the ones who create technology, and others will do it for us if we don't do it as Europeans. That's the first point. One thing you do see in the documents from Brussels is this sense that Europe will become the world's leading technology regulator. This is sad. This is how we all distinguish ourselves. But obviously there's something absurd about this, because if you're the world's leading technology regulator, it means that someone else is developing these technologies and then you're going to regulate them, which is, of course, is a losing battle, because you'll never be able to regulate what others are creating and developing. And second point, I don't think there's an awareness of this. Technology is not neutral. The forms that technology takes depends on the places where technology is developed. AI will be a certain kind of AI if it's developed in Europe, and will be a certain kind of AI if it's developed in the US, and a certain kind of AI if it's developed in China. Technology is colored and inspired by the civilizations out of which it grows. I suspect, for example, that the internet is what it is today. Social media being dominant, micro and targeted advertising being the decisive business model of the internet. It takes these forms because it was developed in California. And if the internet had been developed in Europe or in China, you would have taken completely different forms. And I bring that point up to reinforce the idea that it's very misguided from a philosophical point of view if Europeans and the European Union think that, you know, technology will always be the same no matter where it's developed, and we'll just regulate it. If we leave the task of development to China and the US, the technology we'll have will be of a certain kind if we renounce the task of also embracing the future. I do see some grounds for hope when it comes to climate transition, green technology, where I do, as we discussed several times here in Prague, I do see a different spirit in Brussels and in many European capitals, probably because there's a certain alignment between green technology and the ethics that is dominant in Europe, environmental ethics. And so there's a more enthusiasm about developing hydrogen as a source of energy, bioenergy of different kinds. So there's I think this is an area where Europe can have very quickly good results and become a world leader. When it comes to AI, digital technology, I see the situation more or less hopeless.
So we already mentioned climate change and green being rethought, you know, from more ethical in the past, now more practical, more geopolitical. The technology and the power of technology to bring us to the future. We just mentioned AI and the poles, US and China on the other side, Europe in the middle. Then another big topic that is partially coming also through the book, but now more geopolitically, more practically with Russia war. And I like the idea that you are writing about recently, not only in the book, but on a Substack, about what is the money? what is the money in connection with G20 central bank being sanctioned, what it might bring in the future. Also the role of crypto, despite all the downfall and going south, the Bitcoin, etc. But basically, what's the takeaway from pandemics and partially also Russia war, the money and fragmentation of financial system, which will have impact on us here in Europe as well?
Yes, I mean, this is something I also discuss a bit in the book, and it's become even more important since the book came out. It's another exciting area of contemporary life. We are changing our mind and our views about what money is. By the way, I think we had very naive ideas about what money is. We have this sense that money is some stuff that we hold in our hands, some bills or coins, perhaps a piece of gold. It's not that anymore. Human beings have moved away from the idea of money as stuff to the idea of money as something that is programmed. And money today is just a very complex accounting procedure in computers where some entries are entered. Some people have positive balances in this spreadsheet, so there's negative balances, there are transfers. All this is stored in a computer and can be manipulated or turned off very easily. What we saw during the beginning of the Ukraine war was that Russia had central bank reserves, about $200 billion in the euro system and in the dollar system, and they were frozen simply because the European authorities and American authorities determined that those assets could not be moved. And since they are not pieces of paper, but they are entries in a computer program, they were immediately frozen. Suddenly we were forced to think, well, what is money then? And is it solid? Is it something that we can truly hold? Certainly, Russian central bank found out the hard way that this was not really money, that this was just a credit that the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank had conceded to the Russian central bank, but it could be frozen or canceled. So we are now at an interesting moment when, because we live in a technological society, money became programmable. But at the same time that it became programmable, it kind of dissolved. It became just a line in a computer code. There is now a search to try to combine the two elements, to have money that is programmable, but that is at the same time solid. Money that does not correspond to a liability that someone owes to you. Money that is not credit. If you hold cash or gold in your hand, this is not credit. You have gold in your hand, it's not an amount that someone owes to you, it's an object. But if you have a deposit in a bank, it's not an object, it's just a liability that the bank has, a promise, credit that the bank has to give you that, right? So there's now a search to try to find a form of money that is just as programmable as deposits, but as solid as gold. And unsurprisingly, this is what crypto is. So I don't know, maybe people here are very suspicious of crypto, and I am suspicious too. I think this is going to go through many ups and downs, but the idea of a programmable kind of money that at the same time does not correspond to credit, but is something that you hold yourself, and it's not something that someone else owes to you, is a very powerful and appealing idea that is not going to go away. It started with crypto and may take many different forms. But Bitcoin is something that you can program. For example, if you have Bitcoin, you can create a computer program, a smart contract that determines that your Bitcoin on the midnight of December 31st, 2050 is going to be transferred from your wallet to someone else's wallet. You can program it. You can't program gold. It's there and it cannot be changed anymore. It's programmable, but at the same time, it's something that you hold. When you have Bitcoin, it's exactly like gold. No one owes it to you. You hold it in your wallet. And your wallet is personal. It's not even a bank wallet. So interesting moment when we've moved to a technological point where money became completely programmable, became a computer program. And now there's a reaction, an attempt to make it mean something again, make it be solid again. It's kind of Bitcoin. The best definition of Bitcoin is digital gold, is gold that is programmable. Now, I have some doubts that Bitcoin is going to survive, but something along the lines of programmable gold is going to be with us for a long time.
And there is practical implication coming both of programmable money, and we see during the war that US dollar is a programmable. So what do you think will be geopolitical implication coming out of it? And again, fragmentation of financial system. And you recently wrote about Bolsonaro, that he might be like thinking, hey guys, you know, if Russian central bank reserves can be frozen, mine might be as well. So if you can reiterate, and I like your metaphor with Amazon.
So let me ask you, if you're the governor of the Central Bank of Brazil and you have $100 billion in reserves, where do you put them? And, you know, remember, this is not like gold that you can store in your box. This is something that is going to be stored in a computer somewhere. Do you put it in the computers of the Federal Reserve in Washington? And, you know what just happened to the Russian reserves. Do you think that, you know, we are Brazil, we're not like Russia, we're not planning to invade anyone, so our reserves are very safe there? Or do you start to think very seriously about what happened to Russia and you start to imagine some scenarios? And let me give you a scenario. It's 2035. Europe and parts of the United States are under an unbearable heat wave. Temperatures in Prague reach 51 degrees with high humidity. People blame the climate crisis for this. People are dying, there's nothing to be done. There's lots of news and newspapers saying that the destruction of the Amazon is accelerating climate crisis, and if the destruction of the Amazon could be reversed, that climate could be addressed, and we wouldn't have these heat waves in Europe and the United States anymore. But how do we force the semi-fascist president of Brazil, Bolsonaro Jr., the son of Bolsonaro, to change his policies on the Amazon? Do we send our armies to Brazil? Well, it just so happens that Brazil has $100 billion in the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in Washington. Why not freeze it and then communicate that Brazil will get the money back when it changes its policies on the Amazon? Does this sound far-fetched to you, implausible? Or does something like this actually sound almost inevitable? That this is stuff like this, not necessarily this, but of this kind is going to happen more and more. And if you think that this is going to happen more and more, then you have to start thinking very seriously about the global monetary system, whether the dollar and the euro are safe places, and what alternatives are there. What can you do? Do you collect gold? Do you try to collect dollars in cash? Cash cannot be frozen. But the problem is, it's really not very practical to collect $100 billion in cash. It could occupy a significant amount of space. Let the mathematicians here calculate how many rooms. So there's a lot of energy trying to develop a global monetary system that is less subject to these geopolitical forces. And again, like with crypto, there's a certain search which is becoming more and more desperate for a form of money that is less political and less subject to geopolitical control, but certainly in the middle of this transformation.
Last point in your book, and this is nice wrap this part because we both coming from Germany. So last part of the book, it's about industry revolution, another one. And last many decades, Germany was a big success of previous industrial revolution. Energy, heavy machinery, Mittelstand, all of these things now are in deep crisis. German energy policy failed. Industrial policy failed. Trade policy failed. So if we wrap the discussion about the book, and you can talk either about Germany or more general, so what will be this, like, you know, reindustrialization of the future when we connect all the dots you just spoke about, new money, new system of finance, digital, crypto. What will be the future? We came from Berlin also by electric car. So what's the future of industry?
One comment about Germany and one comment about the future. And they're not necessarily the same anymore, Germany and the future. They used to be the same. This was a bit too mean. I hope it's not being recorded. I mean, the problem with Germany policy is that Germany delegated its defense policy to the United States, delegated its energy policy to Russia, and delegated its trade policy to China. And obviously, this is unsustainable. And we're now going to see pressure from all sides. We're seeing pressure from the defense side, we're seeing pressure from China, and we're seeing pressure from Russia. Already before COVID, the German economy was basically stagnant. There had, in fact, been a recession to quarters of negative growth, and it's even before the pandemic and now before the war in Ukraine. The latest news are also very bad about industrial production in Germany. The reason seems to me clear that Germany's inability to reform and to transform. This is a problem with human nature in general. If you're very successful at something, the resistance to change, precisely to change those things that you're good at, is almost impossible to overcome. And you need procedures in place, and you need a certain kind of culture, or in the case of the individual, a certain kind of character, to be able to continue changing even when you're successful. The tendency is to do the same if you're being successful. Now, the future, just very briefly, and this may be the topic of the next book, in where our economies are going, it seems to me clear that we're going towards this idea of virtual worlds. We are more and more leaving reality behind and embracing something like a virtual reality, and we see virtual reality everywhere. And this is clearly the business model of the future. These new forms of money are forms of virtual money, but they give you powers and capacities that real money does not. You can do a lot more with crypto than you can do with gold. Social media, what is social media? They are virtual worlds. Twitter, and I do spend a lot of time on Twitter. Twitter is a kind of virtual coffee house mixed with a virtual parliament, where politics now increasingly takes place, but it takes place at superhuman speeds with superhuman intensity. It's almost as if you're flying at Mach 4 or Mach 5. It's very intense, it's very rewarding, but it has costs, even psychological costs, as we see more and more, but also political costs, that our politics is being turned upside down by social media, by Twitter in particular. No Donald Trump without Twitter. I think that's important to bear in mind. Someone asked me recently, what is the capital of the world? You write a lot about Asia. Are you saying that the capital of the world is no longer New York, but it's Shanghai? And, you know, it's not really very easy to say the capital of the world is Shanghai, not the least because Shanghai is locked down. And my answer was, capital of the world, obviously, is Twitter. I mean, think about it. If you live in Manhattan and have no access, you're an intellectual, a writer, a politician, and have no access to Twitter, or let's say even to the internet, and if you live in a small village in Botswana or the Democratic Republic of Congo and have access to Twitter, which of these people is more in the center of events, in the center of the action? I mean, to me, the answer seems obvious. You're going to live in Manhattan, you go to some cafes where, by the way, it's not like the 19th century where you have politicians and artists giving improvised speeches in the cafes. You go to a cafe, there's a couple of guys working on an apple and having a cappuccino. Sitting on Twitter, you're in the middle of everything. So I feel very strongly that this is the dominant trend of our lives, that move away from the real world to the virtual world, and that's where money is made, and that's where politics is made, and that's where power is distributed, and power is acquired, and power is lost, and so on.
Well, I'm not from this world. I don't have Twitter. But I admit that so now what we are seeing in the war between Russia and Ukraine, that Twitter and ability of President Zelensky to speak to the world is, of course, part of the fight. But at the same time, we are also getting back to the traditional war, which we haven't seen for some time, and traditional war with not so much sophisticated weapons. Because what we are seeing now in Ukraine is, yes, some UAVs, but not the most modern, not the most capable, and not so much integrated into the battlefield. So how does that virtual world goes together with the real world, as I know it?
Well, this is a tough question. You clearly be a good examiner at a dissertation committee. Well, you know, this is a bit of my answer. Well, the war in Ukraine has two sides. There's the battlefield side, and then there's this battle for central bank reserves, technology flows, semiconductors. We can't lose track of that. But, you know, when I try to think about what happened in Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine, I can't help thinking that this is a purely destructive moment. Nothing is being built there. It's a moment when Russia decides that it will try to destroy the global system of rules and the global order. And therefore, the violence is purely random, and it can be even primitive violence of just making things blow up. The Russian strategist Sergei Karaganov, I interviewed him recently. He calls Russia's effort an effort of constructive destruction. And it's interesting that he uses this expression, which, by the way, comes from economics and Joseph Schumpeter. But he thinks that Russia is trying to destroy the existing order. And I think that part is correct. I don't see any constructive element. If I wrote a book about what the vision that China has for the world order. And I didn't have any trouble writing a 300-page book with China's vision for the world order. I know what the Western European vision is for the world order. The European vision probably would have 1 million pages, not 300. It's a very elaborate set of documents from the Commission. But Russia's vision, I have trouble understanding what it is. By the way, it shifts all the time. 1 month it's one thing, the other month it's another thing. If you try to take this seriously, you're sucked into a vortex of confusion and misinformation. It seems to me that it's simply an attempt to destroy a sophisticated system that exists today of rules, institutions, practices, and that was built mostly by the United States. And Russia is just like taking the hammer and hitting against it in different places as hard as it can to make it break down. And then, you know, Putin talks about this sometimes, that something else will be built on top after this is brought down. He actually, by the way, doesn't seem to have any illusions that it will be built by Russia. I don't think Russia is up to that task. He says that emerging powers will build the new system. China will have a privileged role. Russia will be part of it, will be heard. America will also be part of it. I never saw any suggestion by Putin that he thinks America is finished. He thinks America is finishing as an hegemon, but certainly not as a powerful country.
Will Europe be part of it?
That seems in his mind, if you ask about his opinion, these speeches in the last year, which has become crazier and crazier. And the first time I noticed was went to Valdai last year and saw his speech there. And the way he presented it, it did seem that he doesn't take Europe seriously, that he thinks Europe is eventually going to be divided by the United States and Russia.
Your thoughts about that?
About that?
Is Europe going to be part of this, one of the poles of the multipolar world which we have been as Europeans dreaming about in the last decades? And we have it now?
Well, Thomas, that's kind of the question. Now, I have been defending for a long time that Europe will be part of this world as a pole. Now, if you ask me, is this because as an analyst you think that, or is it because as an intellectual you also want to promote that project? It's a mixture of both. I do think Europe has enormous capacities, but you know, I'm not just an analyst. I try to be an intellectual. That means I try to influence ideas, and I want to, as far as I can, it's not very much, try to support that idea. But I do believe it. I think a unified Europe with all the resources it has, very educated populations, tradition, the legacy. I don't quite buy this idea that Europe is a lost cause. I think we're just waiting for the right crisis to come along, and this may well be it, and to react and to be part of this world. If it doesn't happen, then there are possible scenarios, but obviously the most likely scenario is a scenario of fragmentation, and some European countries will essentially become American economic dependencies. I don't think Europe is an American dependency now, but I think it could become, just subject to very kind of direct American power. Other parts of Europe will come under Russian influence. Other parts may come under Chinese influence. So if this is one alternative, I still believe that the other alternative will be more appealing.
Is Putin helping unifying in Europe or not?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the case. Not just unifying, but waking up Europeans. You know, we're a bit like the frogs in the boiling water, because things move so slowly, we don't see the changes. But sometimes there are experiences where you go back and you listen to an old speech or you see an old document, and the contrast is extraordinary. Well, Europe is today and what it was 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, there was a moment in the Ukraine crisis where Joseph Borrell, that I think he's not been particularly successful in his position as High Representative, but in any case, there was a moment when he announced that funds from the European Peace Facility would be used to buy fighter jets to deliver to Ukraine. I was listening to this, and honestly, I thought I had gone momentarily insane. Is to hear Joseph Borrell announce in public that funds from the European Peace Facility, that one would expect to be used for educating girls in Afghanistan, was now going to be dedicated to buying fighter jets, and to be delivered next week. He even said that it's already being delivered next week. Then it didn't quite work out, but that is a problem. But still, it is a radical change from the Europe of just a few years ago. Now we just have to see if this continues. But as you say, I kind of think it will continue, because Putin, if anything, will make sure this evolution continues.
I have last two questions, and then it's up to you. There will be some microphone, and you can, of course, ask questions or comments. So once we are talking about Europe, Germany, and you have touched already Germany. With COVID, and now with the invasion of Ukraine, probably Europe will not be the same before and after. There is probably some kind of threshold. What is happening in Germany? How do you see from your Twitter world, as well as from Portugal, how do you see Germany really changing or not? Is there a fundamental change going on or not? And not just vis-a-vis the relations with Russia, so even in other angles and other directions. What kind of, is there going to be a really different Germany in 5 years than 5 years ago, or we don't know yet?
I don't think so. Not yet. It could happen, but I don't see any signs of that. And I've been very skeptical of this idea of the Zeitenwende and the change of times that has been announced. I think it's been announced in large part as a way to calm people down and not to be forced to make actual changes. It's a kind of promise, a kind of electoral promise that hasn't been delivered yet. There was a conference 2 months ago with lots of German officials in the UK in Ditchley House. And I was very critical of Germany. That may surprise you, because in this talk I've been so nice. But I was very critical of Germany. And then someone said, "You're being very unfair, Bruno, because Germany has made already dramatic changes to its policy." And I couldn't quite see any changes. There's been an announcement of a one-off fund for developing the defense budget, because the two fundamental changes have not been made. And these are, first of all, this German choice on Ukraine, going back years, doesn't come out of nowhere. It is deeply rooted in German political economy. There's an economic model that relies on cheap energy from Russia and exports to China. Then if you say, well, Germany can change its opinion on Russia and China with the right politicians. No. Germany will only change its opinion on Russia and China if at the same time it changes its political economy. Because the opinion flows directly from the political economy. You cannot be against economic ties with Russia and against economic ties with China if your whole economy is built on the presupposition that you have privileged relationships with, I mean, this seems obvious to me, but just somehow it doesn't seem obvious to German officials. As a Portuguese, I'm particularly frustrated because you remember, if you're old enough, many of you are not, in 2011, 2013, Germany was making the argument to us that we needed to completely reformulate our economies and that we should do it in a period of months, because it's much better to do these things quickly. If you do it slowly, that affects confidence, investment. If you do it quickly, then the problem is solved, investment returns, you have much more credibility. Now I've been having this argument with German colleagues and German friends. Well, what happened to the idea that you make changes quickly? Because now you're telling us that in order to change your energy structure, you're going to need 2, 3, 4 years, and it's impossible to do it in less. Enormous reluctance to change the political economy. And second, enormous reluctance to change Germany's European politics. And this you'll find interesting, I'm sure. Because, you know, the error of Nord Stream 2 and Nord Stream 1, one has to say, comes out of German political economy, and it comes out of a certain understanding that Germany takes decisions alone, even when those decisions impact European partners. Has there been any change in those aspects? What German officials have said has been, and I think I'm being fair to them, including the President Steinmeier, we have made a terrible mistake. And we reserve the right to continue making terrible mistakes in the future, because fundamentally, the paradigm has not changed. There has not been any attempt to say, from now on, decisions that influence the rest of Europe, like Nord Stream 2, will no longer be made in Germany, but will be made at a European level. Our mistake was not a psychological mistake. It was a political mistake that we thought we could make these decisions alone. So Germany would have to change its political economy, and it would have to change its relation to Europe. That fundamental decisions would not be made alone by Germany. Now, I'm kind of curious how a Czech would react to what I just said, because on the one hand, in the case of Germany, you might say exactly that was the problem. Germany didn't listen to Czechs and Poles and Lithuanians. But on the other hand, I know that when I say fundamental decisions in Germany should be made at the European level, like then by Germany, many Czechs, or probably a vast majority of Czechs, will probably disagree with me and say, well, they should be made in Germany.
I don't know. It depends if they are right decisions or not. So, but I can hear you that the German inability to reform, as you said that 20 minutes ago, then it's here to stay and to continue, more likely. As a last question is about China, which you've mentioned already several times, and you wrote a book, The Dawn of Eurasia, which was published prior to COVID, and of course prior to the Russia-Ukraine war. Is there still a hope, or is there still a space for Eurasia? Or is by the last few years basically Eurasia dead? And there will be Asian, meaning Chinese pole of the world, and maybe Indian, of course American, and maybe European, still depending. Or is there still something about Eurasia? Is there some future of Eurasia? Let's say not in the next 300 years, but in the next 30 years.
But you see, I think we already live in Eurasia. It's just that my concept of Eurasia is not of a united political space or a space of peace and harmony. It's a very competitive Eurasia. but I think it would be very mistaken to say that we live in Europe. I think it would be very mistaken to say we are in the Czech Republic, because you can understand very little about the Czech Republic if you limit yourself to the Czech Republic. But I would say, I think that's more or less accepted by most people, that you need to introduce a European dimension. But I think you need to introduce Eurasian dimension. It's very difficult today to understand what happens in Europe. What was the refugee crisis? It was about this problematic integration of the Middle East, the Syria war, Turkey, and Europe. What was our economic crisis at the beginning of the 10s? It was a lot to do with China's rise and China's industrialization and deindustrialization in many parts of Europe, Greece, Portugal, Italy. What is the current crisis? And in 2014 as well, but this clash between two of the constituent blocks of Eurasia, the European Union and Russia. The crisis is whether Ukraine is going to be part of one bloc or part of another. It's like two blocks that are clashing. So everything important happening in Europe right now has to be seen in the context of this very agitated and turbulent supercontinent of Eurasia. It's being redesigned. Eurasia had a certain form. There was Europe, where EU included Russia. Russia was seen as a European country, part of European tradition, literary, the arts, and so on. So there was Europe, including Russia. So Europe went all the way to Vladivostok. Lisbon to Vladivostok is Europe. And then there was Asia, which was underdeveloped, stopped in time, a different kind of world. And Europe was advanced, developed. This was the form of Eurasia, divided into a very large Europe going all the way to Vladivostok and an underdeveloped Asia, where there was poverty and chaos and political chaos. Now, obviously, this picture has completely collapsed, crashed. First of all, Europe is no longer includes Russia. Second of all, you have really to live in the past to think that people in China are riding bicycles around. Asia is undeveloped, or that Indians are passive and conformist and have no great political ambitions. You know, all this is the past. So the previous design of Eurasia has completely collapsed, and now something else is being built, but the process is very chaotic, turbulent, and dangerous. And we really have no idea where this is going. On this, my book, Dawn of Eurasia, just means we now have this empty canvas of Eurasia. But what will be drawn, we have no idea. We don't know if Europe and Russia will once again, after Putin, move closer together, or whether they will be in a kind of cold or hot war. We don't know if India will move closer to Europe or closer to Russia or closer to China. We don't know if Russia will become practically a Chinese colony, or whether Russia and China will be at war, or whether Russia and China will be allies. You see that Eurasia as a whole is being redesigned, and it might take a while, it might take 20, 30 years, but this is a question that is now obviously the center of all our concerns. And I would say all crises that we're going through are about this building up a new Eurasia, since the old one clearly has become a fiction.
I can imagine Russia being younger, smaller, not because of the size, but brother to China or a subject of China. But I can't see that there will be a great alliance of China in India. At least this is my hope, that it would be not possible. Are we there to be balancing China with India? Is it in our interest?
Right, we're doing that, and so far that seems clever, and obviously so far China and India have fundamentally border conflicts.
Thanks God.
Yeah, but they could be solved. Russia and China also had border conflicts, and they were solved. On a number of things, well, I would just say this, don't think, and I'm sure you don't, that India is a part of the Western world. We saw that during Ukraine, that the level of, I think it's fair to say that there is resentment against the Western world, and there is anger against the Western world, which I think it's actually probably the leading force in Indian politics right now, the most powerful force.
I agree with that. I didn't mean that there would be a great alliance soon, at least, of Western world and India. But I also don't believe that there could be a great alliance of India and China. So that these are the poles of the competition, and we can discuss if the Western world is US and Europe, or Europe as a junior partner of US, or at least part of Europe as junior partner of US. Since I don't see hands up, oh, there is one. Not yet.
Hands up there.
Hands up there. So microphone, please, there. And don't worry, we will get to Donald Trump and Joe Biden before this is over. So I have it ready here.
Amen to that.
Thank you. I will start with thanking the organizers for all this. It's great. And I would like to start with answering the question you had to ask Czechs. What would we think about the questions about Germany being answered in Brussels? If it's fundamental questions about Germany answered in Brussels, it's absolutely fantastic. If it's questions about Czech Republic being answered in Brussels, that's an absolute catastrophe. And I believe most Czechs think this way or similarly, because for us, fundamentally, questions being answered in Brussels is no different from questions being answered in Berlin. And I think that you alluded to this on Twitter in some article recently, that all the mistakes people take or credit to European Union are actually French and German mistakes. And then your solution would be to transfer some power to Brussels. But I'm actually curious how that would work, because if I look at Ursula von der Leyen, she destroyed German army more than Putin could, and then she moved on to lead Europe. And how is she now in a better position to lead Europe then? Because she was at the core of this catastrophic policy that literally led barbarians to our gates in here. So that would be question number one. And the second one is directly about the book. You have a segment there on the Attack of Civilization State, I believe is the name of the chapter. I kind of read it like an allusion to Samuel Huntington, and it's not much of a critique of this concept, it's a bit of a new concept, new updated concept. So if maybe as a promotion of the book for the people who haven't read it yet, would maybe offer a short critique of Huntington and tell us a bit more about this civilization state concept. Thank you.
There's a new essay on the civilization state that will come out in the same magazine within 2 months or so. A very long one. Took me a lot of work and effort to write. So if you like the first one, it seems to be quite a popular essay. So it's a new concept to understand world politics, not a nation state, but a civilization state that is based on a distinctive view of the world, a distinctive political philosophy, and civilization states are fundamentally different from nation states. I suggest China, India, perhaps Israel, perhaps in the future Turkey, and the European Union can be seen as civilization states. Now, your first question, well, 2 points. First, don't underestimate the impact that context and structure and office has on politicians. When I was a politician, I would say that like 80% of myself as a politician was the office, the moment, the government, the prime minister, the context, and 20% was myself. People tend to think that it's the opposite. It's like 80% the person and 20% the other things. Because you're part of, not just part of a team, but you're representing a country that moves very slowly. If you as a politician arrive at the office and think you're going to apply your ideas, you won't last a month. So the same happens to, I don't know if it's different in Czech Republic, but the same happens to Ursula von der Leyen.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. The same happens to Ursula von der Leyen. She was a certain kind of politician in Germany, but now, in the European Commission, she said many times that Ukraine has to win, Russia has to lose. And no German politician in this crisis has said this or even come close to this. So she's no longer acting like a German politician. She does have the connections, the influence, her staff, her head of cabinet. That is true, but she also feels the opposite pressure to move in a European direction. And your second question was, how do we make sure that German power is diluted? I'm even afraid that I'm going to become like an agitator for the dilution of German power, and at some point I'm going to be arrested in Berlin or something, because all my conferences recently are about this. That's already an agent of the BND in the last row taking notes. I mean, I think what could this was all a joke. What could happen is, first of all, I mean, the errors that Germany has made have a political cost. We see now in Central Eastern Europe, there's a new confidence and kind of this collective decision. And in the future, Poland, Czech Republic, and others will be more assertive. And I don't think without the prestige that Germany had, that it will be as easy to lead Europe. And second, enlargement. I think one reason that Germany is very, very cold on the idea of Ukraine becoming a member is that at that point, you would have a bloc composed at least of Poland and Ukraine with a collective population of around 85 million people, which is, I think, roughly Germany's population or even a bit more. And this would be a significant counterweight to Germany. And this bloc could even expand. You bring in 45 million Ukrainians into the EU with very different views. I think it would be wonderful. By the way, if I was in charge of Portugal's EU policy, I would be very interested in this. Okay, maybe you will get 10% less in structural funds. What does that matter? By the way, Portugal shouldn't be, or Czech Republic shouldn't be. I think the Czech Republic is already a net contributor.
No, not yet.
But getting close, right? But I think the ambition of Portugal and Czech Republic should be to become net contributors, not be obsessed about funds. And even if there's a little reduction, we would gain a lot more by having a more democratic EU, where French and German power would be diluted by the arrival of new members like Ukraine. So I think it would actually be strategic from the point of view of Portuguese interests to support this kind of process. Here, once again, Putin is helping us a lot, because I think without Putin, the idea that Ukraine would be a EU member would be almost science fiction. But he's giving a helping hand.
Whom do you see as promising European leaders?
Promising?
Yeah. Scholz.
I'm not impressed by Scholz. I'm not impressed by Macron. There are some leaders of smaller countries. The Estonian prime minister has been quite impressive. But you have to keep in mind that sometimes it's a bit easier, and you have a certain freedom as the leader of a small country that you might not have as the leader of Germany. So I'm not. I don't see anyone to really be extremely motivating. I do think von der Leyen has been impressive in this crisis. During the vaccine procurement, it was at the beginning quite disastrous. But even then, she was able to correct. And in this crisis, I think she's been impressive. The way she went to Kiev, her language, and I think she's been able to clearly, for the first time maybe, to clearly separate what is the Commission and EU institutions and what Germany and France are doing. It's not easy to do, but I don't think anyone in the world would make the confusion at this point. Everyone knows that it's Paris and Berlin that are using ambiguous language, that are delaying the enlargement process. Commission is pushing for it. I was told the story in Berlin that when Scholz went to Kiev recently, people in the Commission were following the news and the live feed and kind of cheering to see the moment that he would say, we support Ukraine's membership bid. I'm not sure that public opinion, even in Czech Republic, is quite aware of this, that the Commission is bold and decisive, at least on this topic, and it's Germany that it's dragging its feet, delaying, hesitating. Sometimes in public opinion, it's the opposite idea, that Berlin is decisive, and it behaves as a leader, and the Commission is bureaucratic and passive. Well, at least in this case, it's actually been the opposite. And then I was quite happy as well. At the beginning of the crisis, I even worried that since Ukrainians have visa-free travel to the EU, in my nightmares, when the war started, the EU would approve a decision canceling or suspending visa-free travel. I mean, it seemed conceivable to me. Not only it didn't happen, it wasn't even, you'll know better because you're in those meetings, but my impression is that it wasn't even thought or suggested by anyone. So I think that's that's a strong leadership coming from Brussels. I know you cannot say that in public, but I'll say that.
We are much more worried about Franz Timmermans than Ursula von der Leyen in that. But I must say that she's been doing quite a good job, and it's been always very good talking to her, and everything what was agreed was kept. And by the way, I was also impressed. I usually cannot say anything good about European Parliament, but Speaker or President of European Parliament, Madame Metsola, she's been doing enormously rational, good, straightforward policies, and it's been really interesting to talk to her and see how she's managing. So if it's possible to manage European Parliament.
Questions?
Yes, great. So you have to raise hands up.
You need to raise hands.
So
I already asked you one question before noon when you were autographing your book, but I have one more prepared for this debate, and it touches one of the most pressing issues, I would say, not only in Europe, but a hot topic worldwide, which is energetics and the prices of energy, because we are talking about geopolitics here, but I think that most of the common people don't really have a place in their brain for geopolitics, while their main concern is starting to be whether they'll be able to pay for their electricity bills at the end of the month. And do you think that the climate plan of the green transformation is even achievable under current conditions we have here? Because I've read in the Saxo Bank's outrageous predictions that they issue for every year. Their very first one for 2022 was the climate plan getting a rain check. And I think that already happened. That rain check is here with the war in Ukraine, with the high instability of the Russian both oil and gas market. But what we've seen in the past days, being the climate plans being discussed at the European field, I think that we all realize that there needs to be a serious revision of the plan, but the EU officials don't really keep that in mind because they don't really want to change anything about the Green Deal or the Fit for 55 plans. And you've already mentioned at the beginning of the debate that you believe in human creativity and in scientific and technological breakthroughs. In my opinion, this is the only way how we can achieve the green transformation, through a major technological breakthrough. We've seen in the past many times when there were concerns about the overpopulation and famine, we've invented the new generation of yielding crops and stuff like that, which solved the issue. And do you think that we will see the much needed breakthrough in technology of the energetics that will help us move towards the world we need? Because I would say that everything is getting much, much more expensive, including the research and innovations. And with the energy what's happening now, we would, as humanity, need to push for the price margin to go lower to have the energy that everyone can pay for. Otherwise, even all the tries for new stuff will be more expensive and not really worth for the companies to invest in, because you know what I'm speaking. So you think that the breakthrough will come in the near future?
We already have a number of technological breakthroughs. The question is to implement them. And for that, you need investment, and to have investment, you need the return on investment. And I think, as fossil fuels become more expensive, the positive side is that it becomes much more attractive to invest in other kinds of technologies. It's a comparison game between what you can get out of fossil fuels and you can get out of other technologies. So suddenly, I'm sure there's people revising their investment plans, not only because of political pressure, but also because, batteries now are affordable compared to the price of gas. The problem is some of the components going into this technology, like batteries, are also becoming more expensive, difficult to get because of the Russia crisis. And that takes me to my second point. Geopolitics is important here. So the return of geopolitics has to change everything. We already talked a lot about enlargement. I think it has to change enlargement in the EU, but it also has to change energy policy. Energy policy can no longer be about changing the habits of the European consumer and cannot just be about changing production models inside the EU and change the way our cars work, but it has to be about expanding European influence and power worldwide to make sure that we have access to energy sources that we need and components that we need. That kind of change is going to be probably the fundamental factor in the next few years. You know, traditionally in the world before this war, if energy prices were too high, you might try to increase interest rates so that the economy would cool down with less demand for energy and prices would come down. Central banks would manage. Now we realize that the kind of problems we have today, it's not central banks that manage. It's states, and in many cases it's militaries, projecting influence, solving conflicts, increasing economic and political influence worldwide. That's what I mean by return of geopolitics. Fewer central banks and more ministries of defense. This is the world we live in, whether you like it or not.
Let's take now 3 questions in a row. You mentioned, okay, let's go.
Short question. It was very interesting point about Twitter is a capital. So how it possible? Twitter is prohibited in Russia. Twitter is prohibited in China. So it's quite important part of the world. And secondly, I don't know even more powerful weapon than social media about dividing people and fragmenting people. Thank you.
Let's take here.
In my experience, there have people were always divided into 2 groups: people who like reading science fiction and people who simply don't like reading science fiction. And I think a lot of the technological changes at the digital side, especially, seem to be like something of a revenge of the nerds, definitely a field for the one kind of people, the people who like to read science fiction. And of course, not all the people, I mean, the groups don't perfectly overlap, but some of the technological changes divide people into 2 groups: people who are fascinated and enthusiastic about that, and people who find it creepy. Talking about the ideas of Metaverse and so on. Do you think that this technological stage could work in advantage of certain human types?
Third one.
Good afternoon. My question is related to the point that we will see whether Europe will become one of the poles in the multipolar world or become quite irrelevant. What do you think are the conditions for Europe to be one of the poles? Is it, in your opinion, greater centralization so that there is more efficient decision making? Or is it prevention of its disintegration, which would probably easier be done by greater decentralization, because there's more precious to kind of like spin off and exit Europe if there is greater centralization? Thank you.
Yes. So first, yes, what happened to Twitter in Russia and China, but that just shows how important it is and how central to life, and particularly to political life. That literally this is the place where revolutions can happen. They used to happen in the left bank of Paris. Today, the only city where things are being decided on the street, to some extent Kiev, but other places, everything has become virtual. And it's not surprising that China and now Russia have prohibited Twitter, because this is a dangerous place, but just shows that really truly is the capital. The capital is where revolutions start. They don't start in the provinces, and now they start on Twitter. interesting also that China and Russia make sure that some people still have access. They don't try to crack down on VPNs. All my Russian friends and academics, intellectuals, they're still on Twitter, so I'm not even sure, I wasn't even sure they had been banned, but now I remember it was. You want certain kinds of people to go there and look, but you don't want the masses to go to the capital. I think it works well, the analogy, to be honest. Certain kind of people.
Just to support this idea of Twitter as a capital, as someone who lives in Asia, so you cannot live in China without WeChat. It's just not possible. It's not possible to live without WeChat. The same way in Southeast Asia, it's not possible to live without Kakao or Line. Not possible. So basically, another Twitters.
Yes, you're having different platforms developing in China in particular, but the same dynamics as on Twitter. Different kinds of people, yes, different types for sure. You see that Elon Musk is not only the richest person in the world, the wealthiest person in the world, but also becoming increasingly powerful in the public debate. And perhaps even in the future going to be American president if he wants to. And, you know, it's typical nerd, an engineer, without a great sense of humor, I would say. Asperger, he probably announces that. So it is interesting. This is clearly no longer the world of JP Morgan and pinstripe suits and so on. It's a world of engineers and ruled by engineers to a large extent. It's perhaps the first time that you have an engineer having that a prominent position, not working for others, but a self-promoter like Elon Musk is. And finally, the question about Europe is complicated. Everyone is trying to find out exactly why things don't work as well as they should in Europe. What is the problem? Too much centralization, too little centralization. I think scale is important. You need to have a continent-wide single market that truly works. We still don't quite have that. It's one reason we can't quite compete with the US. We don't have the same kind of continental market that the US has. We don't have an economic financial system that is adapted to the new world and to technological development. Our systems, economic, financial, are based on banks. Banks are very conservative, very traditional. America uses venture capital, seems to work better. But I don't think in the end it's about centralizing or decentralizing. It's about getting scale. And finally, the other factor I suspect is a certain lack of politics. You need politics and you need democratic politics for a society to be truly alive and energetic. And the problem in Europe, the way I see it, is we got into this predicament where democracy is difficult at the national level because competence has been moved to Brussels, many of them. My time in politics in Portugal, I'm sure it's different in the Czech Republic. Sometimes it felt that we were deciding whether VAT was going to be 23.7% or 23.8%. And in the Council of Ministers, the cabinet, we had huge discussions about this, with one group defending 23.7 and the other 23.8, because many of the important decisions are taken in Brussels or somewhere else in the global system. Democracy is difficult at the national level. At the same time, we haven't created the democratic structures at the European level. So we're kind of lost in the middle. And I think that has been a bit of a problem for Europeans. Our politics and our democracy is permanently on a low temperature. Maybe not in Czech Republic again, often quite hot. But this is important. So we need to reinvigorate European democracy by trying to solve this problem of division of labor. We need to have clear competencies at the national level, clear competencies at the European level, and democracy at both levels.
Well, clear contests are fine, but the world ruled by engineers reading science fiction and fascinated by technology being on Twitter, that's really getting frustrating here. Like it's
crossing a red line.
This is about the time to start like ending this session because it gets like really serious. But let me go. One other book which will be published this year. It's your book, History Has Begun, which is a lot about Donald Trump. But you want to make a new edition, or as yesterday you were describing, to somehow refresh it, that it should not be only about Donald Trump. But this is the question: Is Joe Biden just an intermezzo between Trump 1 and Trump 2, or where America sits there, or is it Elon Musk who is there to be the creepy engineer running the world?
Yes, at the beginning of Joe Biden's presidency, there were lots of questions about what is this going to mean, what kind of politics is Joe Biden going to represent, and he's been struggling to represent anything beyond the opposition to Trump. The problem, as I see it, is the energy of the Democratic Party is in the far left, the woke left. This is where you have real energy, but not acceptable to vast parts of American society. And so Joe Biden has been caught between a very active far left that he knows is going to be toxic and the rest of the party that doesn't seem to represent much anymore. So beyond the opposition to Trump, it's difficult to see what Joe Biden represents, and I think that explains part of his problems. I saw the polls yesterday. He has the lowest approval rate of every president ever, including Trump. And this is before the recession really begins, the inevitable recession that is coming. So I'm curious about the kind of approval numbers he will get in 1 year, but it will truly be a sensational historical record.
So it's intermezzo between Donald Trump 1 and Donald Trump 2.
Yes, so we were discussing this among some of us earlier today, and I think, it's going to be a very interesting primary. Trump is going to run, but the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, is a really interesting, charismatic politician, and I wouldn't necessarily exclude that it could be Trump, particularly because Trump is getting old, both in terms of his age and in terms of the novelty that he brought in 2016. And it's possible to detect certain signs of tiredness in American society, even a little bit in the Republican Party. So if Ron DeSantis appears as the next big thing, and he's charismatic, he's provocative, he appeals to the far right of the party, so he's very strong in the primaries. That Trump is the only person that is afraid of is DeSantis.
So I think great finally. So thank you very much, Bruno, for being here with us at Sebro Institute. Thank you for bringing us your thoughts and your book. Book is over there. Bruno is here. So whoever brings book from there to here, it's going to be signed. So thank you very much once again, and great having you here.
And thanks for you for coming. Thanks for PPF for supporting it. Thanks, Katerina, for organizing, and everyone else who has been helping. And we hope to see you here again. And really, thank you very much for coming to Prague.